Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me today. I'm still on my mission to read every single email that people have sent through the website before the end of the year. Let's get to it. An anonymous patron, she says, could you talk a bit about attachment theory and how it relates to pets? I don't fully understand it, but I would love to know what the benefits are and if it can help from healthy attachments and other aspects of life. End of email. Well, for the sake of time, I'm going to answer this as quickly as possible, but I believe, and there's not a lot of research on this, but there's some, that our attachments to our pets are the same virtually as they are to humans, potentially. You know, some people treat their pets not like other attachments. You know, when I was growing up, for example, we had outdoor cats that I was really attached to, but my parents just thought of as like, where's that cat? Do we even have a cat? It was very much of an afterthought. But other people are like me and my wife Stacy, and our dogs and other animals that we've had over the years have been absolutely other family members that we love and have relationships with and get a lot of attachment, security with. You know, when you reach out to your cat and your cat snuggles with you, it's absolutely emotionally gratifying. That's why we have them. I mean, it's obvious that these animals are a drain on our life. They take away our money and food and space and time, and you know, they don't give us anything. You know, most of our animals, our pets, don't hunt for us or work for us or carry things for us. It's like, it's all downside. So what are we getting out of it? Well, obviously we're getting a relationship out of it. We're getting an attachment out of it. We're getting someone that we can take care of, someone who's there for us, someone who cuddles with us, someone that we can have physical affection with, someone that we can play with. And it, you know, in the same way that you have other humans like that. And there's nothing pathological about it. It's totally fine. Can one be too dependent on animals and because of, you know, bad experiences with humans? You know, maybe. I don't know. I don't want to jump to that conclusion. I think it's possible for someone to live alone and have one or more pets and maybe get all their attachment needs met. I don't know if I've ever said that before. So, and in the same way that when an animal rejects us, if we're needy of the animal, it hurts. And the animals that we choose to let into our homes are bred or evolved themselves to become similar to humans in terms of at least their behavior regarding their attachment. Dogs in particular, cats as well. And there's been a lot of research on this. You know, is your animal really attached to you, or are you just a means to an end? And I find that when I read all the research, it's obvious that the dogs and most of the cats really bond to particular humans. Again, particularly dogs. But you'll hear people say like, "Oh, my dogs don't love people. That's just anthropomorphizing. They of course, they just want you for their food." For years, I had a robot, you know, a feeder feed my cats, and so they didn't associate me with food at all. And yet they loved up on me. And when I came home, they meowed and they were happy to see me and they wanted to hang out with me and they liked playing. You know, I had nothing to do with their food, and they absolutely bonded with me. Anyone who's had animals knows this to be true, and it's obvious. And anyone who like poo-poos that, I find it's like, you must never have lived with a dog or a cat that loved you. And I feel sad for you. Anyway, next email. All right, this next email is from anonymous annual patron. She wrote a fairly long email, but the main question that she's getting at is, quote, how can someone feel a lot of empathy in some situations, but have very impaired empathy in others? End of email. Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated topic. And I think the first thing I'll say is that empathy is complicated and people are complicated. And when you have a situation, you described, anonymous annual patron, how he really hurt your feelings in a situation. He didn't seem to really understand it. But in other situations, he can be very caring. And I think that there's this general discourse among lay people and maybe among clinicians as well, to some extent, that if someone exhibits a lack of empathy, there must be something pathologically wrong with them, and there must be a diagnosis associated with that. And that's an oversimplification, and not, it's probably not usually true. If you come across someone that exhibits lack of empathy, the chance that you'll be able to diagnose them based on that is pretty slim. So there's that. I just want to, because I think that a lot of people, oh, they must be a narcissist, or it must be a sociopath or something. It's like, well, they could be, or they have dependent personality disorder. People with dependent personality disorder, not always, can actually have a lot of impairment to their empathy because they're primarily focused on other people taking care of them, and they don't really even understand that they impact other people. Or they just are having a bad day, or they, and as you describe in your email, they have avoidant attachment and they're not in touch with their feelings. When you're not in touch with your feelings, you're definitely not in touch with other people's feelings. Or you have traumas or schemas that are being triggered in a moment. There's a lot of reasons why someone in one instance would have seemingly no empathy and even report it, maybe even say like, yeah, I don't even think I registered that I hurt other people. And in other situations where they absolutely do have empathy. In most cases where people exhibit lack of empathy, in other contexts, they will exhibit empathy. All right, this next email is from anonymous annual patron. Annual patron Diana from Louisville says, can you explain panic attacks and parenthesis? I think what you mean, Diana, is paresthesia. Not parenthesis, but I could see the confusion there. So paresthesia is a sensation of like numbness or tingling in your extremities or in your body, and sometimes there's a reason for that, like a neurological problem, nerve problem, or sometimes it's nervousness or stress or something. Anyway, so annual patron Diana from Louisville says, can you explain panic attacks and paresthesia? I just experienced panic attacks the last several days. I really thought I had something neurological going on and that I was going to die of a stroke or heart attack. I went several days having paresthesia, which would trigger full-blown panic attacks. When I went to see my doctor, she said I had classic signs of panic. Can you explain why we have panic attacks and how it affects our physiology and our emotional response? End of email. Yeah. So in brief, and I've talked about panic attacks a lot, I suffered from panic attacks when I was younger for many years, and actually becoming a therapist and learning about panic and anxiety and therapy, I actually cured myself of my own panic attacks. But the panic attacks I had were rough. I mean, when people talk about, oh my God, I had a panic attack, I was so scared. I was watching a horror movie and I had a panic attack, and I'm like, did you have panic attack? Well, yeah. They're like, yeah, it was so scary. And I'm like, no. Panic attacks are so all-consuming physiologically and psychologically. It's intense, and there's a good chance that you've never actually experienced a panic attack. You might have had high anxiety before, but panic attacks are really something else. I had a panic attack that lasted for a couple days, and just imagine that. Just imagine like a couple days where your body is more scared than it's ever been in its life for 2 days. You know, people who talk about an anxiety attack, they'll talk about like, oh my God, I was so nervous for 5 minutes. And you can have a panic attack that lasts 5 minutes. Anyway, the point is that panic attacks are rough. And Diana, you're saying that you had some panic attacks over the last several days, and you had tingling sensations, I think is what you're talking about, in your body, and it made you feel like you were having a stroke or a heart attack. And that's usually what will provoke a panic attack, is a physical sensation. And without going into details, there's a fair amount of research demonstrating that people who pay attention to their body a lot, there seems to be a dial of personality, like a spectrum of personality, where some people are very aware of their body, when their body has a tingling sensation, or when they have to go to the bathroom, or when they're hungry, or when they're cold. They're really sensitive. They might even be more sensitive just neurologically in general. But at the very least, there's some people that notice their body a lot, and there are other people who are lower on that spectrum and don't really notice what's happening in their body. So if you match up someone who notices their body pretty well, and they're very neurologically sensitive, and they're prone to anxiety, then it can and they might have the biological disposition for anxiety and panic, then that's what'll cause panic attacks. Is because you're sitting there and all of a sudden you just feel something kind of weird, like a tingling or a pain in your chest or a headache, or your vision goes a little funny, or something weird happens, vertigo, and then the anxiety, the interpretation kicks in is I'm having a heart attack or I'm going to die, or and this panic sets in, and it's utter panic. The whole body just flips out, and then there's a feedback loop, because the more stressed out we are and the more focused we are on the tingling or the heart attack sensations, psychogenically we can actually cause or exacerbate symptoms. Like, let's say you have a tightness in your chest that is really, it's not related to a heart attack, and it might not even be related to anything. It's just like a random physical, our bodies just do weird things sometimes, or at least we don't know why it does a lot of things that it does. So let's say you have a non-heart attack related tightness in your chest that's just, it's barely perceptible. You just feel it like a little bit. And then boom, you interpret it as I'm having a heart attack, and then you flip out. And now what happens is your brain goes into fight or flight in this very panic way, and you can't think anymore because your blood is draining away from your higher brain, and because you need to run. Fight or flight is a tiger is about to kill you, and you got to fight, you got to run. And we don't need to do high math. We don't need to think about things very much. We just have to run or fight. That's all we got to do. And so it makes it so that the individual going through it, they can't really think through it very easily. In fact, it makes it practically impossible for the individual to be like, maybe I'm just having a random feeling, like there's no ability to reflect on what's happening. The train is left to the station, and it's physiological, it's automatic. It doesn't, PTSD, panic attacks, panic or trauma triggering can kind of be similar to this. It's not the same, but anyway, so you can't think, all your blood is rushing to other parts of your body, and your brain starts to become very convinced that something's wrong, and you're very stressed out. Well, our brains can cause, our psychologies can cause physiological problems happen in our body. We understand that the mind-body differentiation is meaningless. Our mind is our body, and our body is our mind. And when we're stressed out, we can actually create psychogenically what some people call psychosomatically symptoms in our body. So we feel a little sensation, the train leaves the station, fight or flight, total panic. Then we're focusing on our chest, and our stress actually causes pain to exist in our chest. Then we remember, oh yeah, if you get pain in your left arm, then that means you're having a panic attack. And then psychogenically, you actually subconsciously create pain in your arm. You don't misperceive. You actually create inflammation or some kind of nervous system problem in your left arm that actually sends pain signals back up to your brain, and so on and so on. And it's real. And so a lot of these people end up in the doctor's office, and when the physicians look you over and they do all the tests and everything, and they find, well, there's nothing wrong with you, but it sounds like you might have had a panic attack. I don't know the percentage, but it's a pretty high percentage of people who end up in doctor's offices complaining about heart attacks are actually only suffering from panic attacks. Now, panic disorder is awful, but you shouldn't be in the ER. You should be talking to a specialist in psychotherapy and possibly taking meds for it. But really, you need psychotherapy, because that's the best. Like for me, I cured my panic without any drugs. I did it completely with essentially cognitive therapy. But so there's that. Having said all that, there are a lot of people who are suffering from legit physiological problems. They go to the doctor can't figure out what it is, and they just say it's a panic attack, when in reality it is something physical. So there's that too. But you say, can you explain why we have panic attacks? Well, like I said, it's mixture by, we don't really know why. Some people are born with a disposition. Some people are neglected when they're growing up that makes them prone to anxiety because they were kind of chronically afraid and alone growing up, or traumatized or triggered, or something like that. And you say how it affects our physiology and our emotional response. Oh, I feel like I kind of did that. Next email. All right, this next email is from Anonymous Patron. She writes,
I was wondering if you could talk about how perfectionists can become enraged when they feel that others aren't putting in as much effort into getting things done as well as they are. I get extremely upset at my partner. I got extremely upset at my partner, and I'm a perfectionist, for talking to one of my students without consulting with me about its ethicality and what boundary violations they could be crossing. Being a person who was consistently on time for things might make them incredibly angry when other people are late. To other people, it might seem that perfectionists are too anal or annoying and that they need to just relax, but to a perfectionist, relaxing is never an option. Do you have any thoughts on this? Have you observed something similar? End of email. Yeah, so basically what an honest patron is saying is that she is a perfectionist and she gets really upset when other people do things that challenge her hopes for things being in order, and that we don't often talk about the rage that some perfectionists can exhibit. And, I did a whole deep dive on perfectionism, and you can listen to that if you're a patron, I believe. Eventually I'll probably rerun it, and it's pretty complicated. But, when I first started looking into perfectionism, I thought, I was first prepping on the deep dive, I remember thinking, this will be pretty easy. But I was looking at all the research, and then I started thinking about it more, and I realized that perfectionism is like a really complicated, diverse topic. There's a lot of different dimensions to it. Like, for example, one dimension is, do you have self-esteem or not? If you have, so perfectionism, in a nutshell, is striving for high standards. You hold yourself to to doing things very well, and you like things to be in order, and you don't like to screw things up. So, but essentially, you have really high standards for yourself or other people. If you have low self-esteem and you have high standards for yourself, then whenever you make a mistake, you're going to hate yourself, and you're going to mess something up at work, and you're going to be like, yeah, there it is, I'm a failure. Whereas other people who aren't perfectionistic, when they make a mistake and they have low self-esteem, they'll just be like, yeah, well, whatever. But if you hold yourself to a high standard and you don't meet it, then it can ruin your life. It can make you depressed and anxious, and hate yourself even more. There's all sorts of bad things when you match up perfectionism with low self-esteem. But if you have good enough self-esteem, like I do, and you're a perfectionist, then it actually works in your favor. You are actually, very goal-oriented, and you push yourself to succeed. And when you do achieve something, you actually feel really good about it. You get a lot done. You have good outcomes. When someone hires you, you actually deliver, and that kind of stuff. So perfectionism in and of itself, it has to be considered within the context of everything else, within the person's personality. The other dimension that I like to think about is where the perfectionism is applied. So some people have high personal standards, and that's what I've been talking about thus far. You can be perfectionistic about your own outcomes. When you bake a cake, it has to be perfect. When you do yard work, it has to be complete and it has to look good. When you wash the toilet, or when you make an art thing, it's like, for example, with me and Umberto, we talk about this sometime. We're both perfectionistic when it comes to music, but he has something that gets in the way of him actually achieving things in the past. Not so much, I think he still does, but so we're both perfectionistic, but given my personality makeup, I actually still complete musical projects, even though I'm never satisfied with them when I complete them. In fact, when I listen back to past musical projects that I've recorded, I always cringe. I'm like, that should have been changed. That should have been changed. Whereas with Berto, his perfectionism actually grinds him to a halt, such that most of the time he never puts any of his music out there. So there's that. But anyway, high personal standards is one type. Another is a preference for order and organization. So this, you could say, is conscientiousness, but also could, taken to an extreme, become really debilitating, on the OCD spectrum, if you will. But so that's another type of perfectionist. And another type of perfectionist is concern for other people. Sorry, let me back up here. I think I'm reading from the wrong list. Sorry, backing up. I was reading from the wrong list. Okay, so there's erase everything I just said over the last couple minutes. There's self-oriented. This is the Hewitt multi-dimensional perfectionism scale. So developed by Hewitt and Flett in 1991. So you have three types. You have self-oriented perfectionism. I already talked about that. You have other-oriented perfectionism. This is unrealistic standards for other people to be perfect. And of course, this would be problematic, right? It could be abusive. To hold other people to a high standard is not fair, right? Because it's unrealistic. And then the third type is socially prescribed perfectionism. So this is when you feel like you have to be perfect for other people. Think of if you are a woman of a particular cultural pocket and you feel like your skin has to be flawless and your body has to be flawless and your hair has to be flawless, even though for yourself you don't really care. But because of your undifferentiation or oppression or the way you're treated, you have internalized this perfectionism. You don't really care about how you look, or you kind of care, but not that much. But you feel like you have to be perfect because society makes you feel, or if your parents are forcing you to be perfect, that kind of thing. So there's self-prescribed perfectionism, which is the one I have. There's other prescribed, where you're controlling other people and making them be perfect. And then there's socially prescribed perfectionism. And I like that distinction as well. But what you're talking about, anonymous patron, is the rage part of this, is that, like for instance, you're saying that your partner, my partner for talking to one of my students, my partner talked to one of my students without consulting me. And so I'm guessing what happened to you was you have this, and you're framing it as perfectionism of he broke a rule. So you're really perfectionistic and uptight about following rules and about not getting in trouble. So that's where the nuance comes in, because is that perfectionism, or is that self-oriented perfectionism? Is it other-oriented perfectionism, or is it socially prescribed perfectionism? Do you want to be perfect about the ethicality of your job, or are you so terrified of being judged by others that you feel like you have to be perfect to live up to other people's standards? So all that has to be kind of sifted through, because for me, I'm okay with my perfectionism. I don't try to get rid of it. I like it. I use it. I hone it, if you will. This podcast, for example, when I first started making it, I wasn't very good at podcasting for the first 7 years, but I was such a perfectionist that it made me work really hard to make the podcast episodes listenable, even though I wasn't a very good podcaster. I had to listen. I would record the episodes and I would listen back to them several times and edit like minutia, little ums and knows and stumbles and this kind of thing. I would edit all that out, and I would move sections around. And so my perfectionism in the podcasting career path for me actually, I think, kind of helped me. It helped me learn, kept me dedicated. I hope it produced a better product in the beginning, and to some extent still does. So so it's not that perfectionism is bad, but what you're talking about is when you get real angry, and or other people get angry when they're being perfectionistic, and it's not a good idea. So you're saying, do I have any thoughts on it? I feel like I already got over that. Have I observed something similar? Yeah, absolutely. And if you have, so for me, I can be this way too, but if I am balanced and differentiated, I can see the bigger picture. Like a humorous example is when I see signs that have apostrophes that shouldn't be there, or how gas stations have those signs that have letters on them, like interchangeable letters. What's it'll say like 50% off, and it'll be these letters that they put up with those big poles. I hope you know what I'm saying. Well, one of the things that will drive me bananas is when they put letters upside down, like an S. The shading is such that even though the S will look like an S if it's upside down, it's supposed to be oriented a certain way because the shading on the S is supposed to be a certain way. Do you know what I'm saying? Anyway, I will see stuff like that and it'll make me upset. I'll go like, I'll have this tiny bit of motivation urge to go into the store and say, can you give me the pole? Cause I need to change that S around cause it's upside down or something like that. K's are sometimes upside down. Anyway, but because I'd like to think I'm differentiated enough, I go, well, it's not important. And in the grand scheme of things, who cares? And I'm probably the only person that cares that's driving on this road. I don't know. So, that's a humorous example, but like with your partner talking to one of your students without consulting with you, it makes sense that you would be upset. But if your perfectionism is engaged and you're freaking out because he did something that kind of screwed up your perfect record or something, and you flip out and ruin your relationship temporarily because you're hyper-focused on your perfectionism goal in life, the value of being perfect, without thinking of the bigger picture, which is, I need to have a good marriage, or maybe it's not even that big of a deal. That's what we need to do. We need to be differentiated. We need to be in our perfectionism at the same time of zooming out and looking at our perfectionism from afar and the rest of ourselves and everyone else involved, and so that we don't make mistakes. All right, this next email is from patron Lisa from Sun City, California. She says, as my children grew and left home, I began to collect things, and I wonder at what point does the collector turn into a hoarder? End of question. Yeah, so I've done episodes on hoarding disorder before, a couple, I believe, with my colleague Jennifer Sampson McNamara, who specializes in hoarding disorder. Her research was on that. She actually founded a clinic consortium in Tacoma, Washington, called the Hoarding Project, I believe it was called. Anyway, it's still around. And I had her on the podcast a number of times to talk about it, so you can go into the archives and listen to that. But hoarding, in a nutshell, when it becomes a disorder is when it becomes a problem. So if, for example, you love to collect little Santas or something, and you buy every day, you're online for a couple hours on eBay searching for Santas, and you buy a couple Santas every day, and every day the shipments are coming, more Santas, and your house is starting to look a little cluttered. You're having a hard time trying to figure out where you're going to put it. As long as your work is still okay, and your job is, your relationships are still okay, and your health is still okay, and you're not completely ruining yourself financially, then it's fine. You just have a minor obsession with Santas. And from the outside, it might look like you're a quote unquote hoarder, but if it doesn't cause any problems in your life, then it's not a disorder. It's just something that you do. So in the same way that if you gamble, for example, and you love to gamble, and you think about gambling, and let's say even you gamble every day, but you're able to pay your bills, you're able to put food on the table, your mortgage is fine, you still have your retirement, your relationships are okay. Maybe your partner isn't super enthusiastic about the fact that you lose some money sometimes, but it's not the end of the world. You have separate finances or something. Then you don't have a gambling problem. You gamble a lot, but you don't have a gambling problem. From the outside, someone might say you have a gambling problem, but not according to the definition. Now, what constitutes a problem? Where is exactly that threshold? Well, it's an amorphous construct, and it's opinion-based. And in my field, there's a lot of people that like to think it's this really concrete thing between non-disorder and disorder, but it really isn't. And it's in the eye of the beholder. So let's say that you start getting a lot of Santas, and let's say that 2 of your bedrooms your children grew up and left home. Let's say two of your kids' bedrooms are completely filled to the brim with Santas, and you can't use those rooms for anything else. Well, is that a problem? Well, some clinicians might say, well, we're getting there. Other people might say, no. I mean, or they might just ask you, is it a problem for you? And you'd probably say like, no, it's fine. So there's a gray zone there. Having said that, people who suffer from hoarding disorder, it's obvious that they have a problem. People who have hoarding disorder, I'm sure you've seen the TV shows or the news clips or something. It is astonishing what's going, the amount of stuff that they hold on to and how irrational it is. That's what makes it a disorder. Disorders are typically pretty pronounced. When you have panic disorder, for example, it's not just like mild anxiety or temporary anxiety. It's completely debilitating. Hoarding disorder, typically when we're talking about someone who's diagnosed with it, it's severe. Having said that, there's a spectrum, like I said. So the key is it ruining my life? You say, you're collecting things. Is it? And so don't worry about, is it hoarding or is it collecting? Because it's a similar thing when people say like, am I drinking socially or am I an alcoholic? And those words are so fraught with so many different things. The key is it ruining your life? Even a little bit. Now, if it's ruining your life just a little bit, and you can kind of keep it at that level and you're okay with that, then at least you're looking at it honestly. But the other thing about hoarding disorder is that there are schemas and cognitions and beliefs that drive the hoarding that are disordered. For example, typically someone with hoarding disorder believes that to let go of something is to do something very horrible. And all of us can kind of relate to this, right? And I think this is why a lot of people start wondering if they have hoarding disorder. Like, do I have hoarding disorder? Because I think all of us can relate to the feeling of, should I give this to the secondhand store? Should I throw this away? I haven't used this in 5 years. Do I need it? And you just have this dilemma. And for a lot of people, they just hold on to it. And then their garage fills up with a bunch of useless crap. And then they wonder, how come I can't get rid of stuff? I think that, it's pretty normal. And in all likelihood, you don't have hoarding disorder, because the people with hoarding disorder, it's that belief, like, I better hold on to it, ramped up times 100. It is intense. The amount of irrationality they have around things is pathological. It's on the level of almost being schizophrenic. It's delusional. This idea of like, because you come to them and Jennifer Sampson McNamara would do this. She would go to the homes and with teams and talk to these people. And by the way that you treat them is to take it very slow. You never just come out like the TV show. They clean it out. Research shows that within, I think, even just a few months, the hoarding will be back and it'll be worse than it was before they did the clean out. Meaning that the house is completely filled with stuff again. Because the problem isn't the stuff. The problem is the psychology. The problem is the person has a mental disorder that needs to be treated. It's like, coming over to someone's house who is an alcoholic and just taking all the alcohol out of the house. Well, they're just going to buy more alcohol, you dummy. So it's the same with hoarding disorder. You need to take it very slow. People are often coming from a traumatic place. Often it's a trauma response. They were 4 years old and poor and being abused, and they just locked in this notion that things are going to protect them or something along those lines. And they just, so when you go to these individuals and you have them look around their house, and it's obvious that 99.9% of this stuff should go and is complete junk anyway. You say to them, do you think this stuff should go? Like, you just point to something, you think, do you think that, I don't even know what that is. It looks like a pile of gross things. Should we get rid of it? The person with hoarding disorder will be like, no, I need that. You don't understand. Like, I need that. That's something I'm going to need. So it's often semi-delusional. So if you're not in that realm, then you don't suffer from hoarding disorder. Now, if not all people are that bad, but anyway, my point is that when you're evaluating your own collection or non-pathological hoarding, just evaluate if it's what you really want. And if it's what you want, and all the consequences of holding on to all this stuff or collecting all this stuff are cool with you, then great, you're fine. But if you're collecting, like some people will collect compulsively, meaning they're not really enjoying the process. It's more of like an itch that they have to itch. So they're not doing it out of pleasure. They're doing it out of desperation. And so there's all that would require or would, mean that therapy is in order. And if you're not sure, then obviously get a therapist by, get an evaluation by someone that understands hoarding disorder well. All right, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. I want to do an OPP, an old patron praise, for those patrons who signed up all the way back in June of 2019 and stayed patrons this whole time. We have Gabrielle from Seattle. We have Molly from London. We have Amanda from God knows where. We have Jay from Brooklyn, New York. We got Jennifer from Santa Monica. These are some great places: Seattle, London, Brooklyn, Santa Monica. We got Layla from Williamstown, Australia. I don't know about that. But Alyssa, good old Alyssa from Yelm, a friend of mine. Fur from Los Angeles. Steve from Snohomish, a Snohomi Steve. Savannah from Seattle. Michelle from Australia, Brunswick East. And Andrea Basel, Czechoslovakia, I believe. Anyway, thank you so much for becoming patrons and staying patrons this whole time. Super cool of you. All right, this next email is from anonymous patron. I'll just summarize here. They basically are saying that they have a lot of physiological and psychiatric problems, but their typical coping mechanism is to deflect and avoid when other people ask them, do they need anything? And so when they are suffering, so they're suffering, and then they tend to avoid their problems, which I'm guessing signals to others that maybe they don't have problems. But then when they need support and help, other people don't respond very well. They don't jump to help. And so the anonymous patron is saying, how can I explain to other people that I need some patience and understanding? Well, one, you can just say it. But I'm guessing that there's a barrier there. I'm guessing that there's some psychological schema or trauma that's making it so that you avoid and deflect, as you say. So I would go to therapy for that. And once you figure out what you're afraid of, because I'm guessing there's something you're afraid of. You're afraid of being dependent. You're afraid of being let down. You're afraid of being seen like a weakling, or you're afraid that someone will discover that you're in need and they'll exploit you, or something's going on. There's some fear that needs to be healed from. And then it takes a long time. I've worked with people on this issue, and it takes a long time. It takes a long time to learn how to ask for help. It seems so easy, but for people who struggle with it, it can take years and years to really get into the mindset and the habit. Next email from patron Tara from Detroit. Tara, good old Tara. I was trying to remember your name. Was it on the air or off the air? And I was like, what was her name? I know she's in Detroit, and I know that the Lions are terrible, and I know she has a bunch of athletic pictures people's on her workout wall. So anyway, you wrote in, Tara, he says, I have recently experienced the loss of my father, divorce, and a discovery of a history of trauma yet unrecognized. Well, chiming in here, Tara, I'm sorry, really sorry. A loss of your father, a divorce, and a discovery of a history of trauma. That's a lot. You say, I should be very angry. I have been lied to, abused, and manipulated. I have a right to be angry, and honestly, I feel like it may help to be angry. Not feeling angry feels like I'm missing a step. I assume I am pushing it down or repressing it somehow for some reason,
Am I correct in my assumption? Is anger a part of the healing process? Can I fully heal without it? End of email. Well, Tara, I don't know. It's not enough. There's no universals there, but I wouldn't be surprised if you weren't suppressing it. I mean, to be lied to, abused, and manipulated, yeah, that's a lifetime of anger right there. And if you don't feel any anger about it, then that lends itself to the conceptualization that you're suppressing it because of fear. There's a lot of messages given to children that fear is not okay from various different angles. So I work with a lot of people, particularly women, by the way, on anger. For some women clients, I will spend 10 years, and half of the therapy that we're doing is on them connecting with their anger. And because it seems like such an easy thing to do. It's just like, well, just be angry, just connect with your anger. It's so much more complicated than that. There's so many voices that kick in. And physiologically, in the same way that, I talked about how I, in the 6th grade, suppressed my tears such that I never cried again for a long time. So when I was 20 years old and I should be crying, I wouldn't cry because I physiologically got rid of the ability to cry. And it took me a long time to reconnect with my ability to cry. And I worked on it throughout my 20s and beyond. And now I cry at the drop of a hat. So in the same way, we can do that with anger. You can suppress such that it's, even when you want your anger, it's really hard to access. But anger is a wonderful thing. And one of the things that I've talked with my women clients is how wonderful and how powerful and how proactive and empowering anger can be, and how you deserve to have anger. Because for a lot of people, and I think particularly women, are taught that anger is destructive, that anger is to be a bully, anger is to cause problems and conflict. And it can, but anger can also motivate you to seek justice. It can feel good and cathartic to recognize injustice and to viscerally feel the associated emotions such as anger. For example, for me, I think on this podcast, you notice I get angry sometimes. Not as angry as I get in my personal life, but angry. And it motivates me to stand up for things and to say no. You can't do that to people. You can't say that people that have emotions are wrong. You'll hear me yammer about stuff and stand on a soapbox, and that's one of the manifestations of my anger. And if I didn't feel anger, if I wasn't comfortable with my anger, I wouldn't have those kinds of conversations. I wouldn't even feel the injustice, and I wouldn't fight for injustice. And a lot of women have experienced injustice, and a lot of women are told they can't be angry, that they're a nasty bitch or whatever it is that they get called, or they're bossy, right? You're so bossy. 4-year-old girl who acts like a normal human being is called bossy. Anyway, so I imagine that you're on a long process to connect with your anger. Now, you also say, is anger part of the healing process? Maybe. I wouldn't say it's integral for everyone. And then you say, can I fully heal without it? Well, I don't think you're ever going to fully heal anyway, Tara. Sorry to say that. But, and I would say that if you are suppressing your anger, which we don't know, that, a good percentage of your healing would involve connecting with that for sure. But again, talk with your therapist. All right, this next email is from patron Natalie from Geneva. She says, would you have a bibliography or a few reading recommendations for an integrative approach to case conceptualization? End of email. I'm not particularly good at bibliographies or recommendations, but I do have a lot of books on case conceptualization, and I thought I would just read all the books that I have about it. I have a book by Meyer called Bridging Case Conceptualization, Assessment, and Intervention. I have a book by Berman called Case Conceptualization and Treatment Planning. I have a book by, I'm sure there's other books. There's psychodynamic case conceptualization. What is that called? Psychodynamic. I'm looking at my little database here. Anyway, yeah, this is terrible. But you also talk about integrative approach. And there are books on integrative therapy that I can also look up in my stupid database. If I did close it, I could integrate. So every book and article that I have in my office, I have to have a database because it's hard to find things. But Case Approach to Counseling and Psychotherapy is a book that has that. Anyway, there's lots of books on integrative, but I'm just trying to find, Integrative Multi-Theoretical Psychotherapy by Brooks and Harris. I recommend that book for any therapist, honestly. I've talked about this book before, but it's called Integrative Multi-Theoretical Psychotherapy, Brooks Harris. The book, it summarizes all the major umbrellas of therapy in this very concise, easy to, a layperson reading this book would say, oh, I understand that concept. And it lays out, it'll say like family systems therapy, and it'll give a couple pages of kind of the background and like the general premise. And then it lists all the interventions and the preferred outcomes and all that kind of stuff. I learned so much by reading that book. Anyway, I gave you a terrible answer. Natalie from Geneva. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at that. Next email from annual patron Jess from Utah. She says, today my therapist brought up practicing giving myself wholeness and being able to feel whole. He tried to explain what it means to be able to feel whole, but maybe it's such a foreign concept for me that I just don't understand it. For some context, we were discussing how it feels like I'm never enough and how I'm a perfectionist with low self-esteem. Can you describe what it's like to feel whole and how to become more whole? End of email. Well, Jess, yeah, obviously I would really sift through this with your therapist because I could give you my impression of what your therapist meant by that, but I would really be shooting in the dark. So obviously I would, and it sounds like it's a pretty important thing that you and your therapist have to understand about each other. And this goes for any of y'all out there. If your therapist ever says anything or does anything that confuses you, and it's, a question that you think about after session, it is your responsibility as a client to bring that up in therapy. You have to, if you think it's even remotely important for you to understand something that your therapist did that you don't understand, do not wait. That as a client, when you show up to, therapy, you have some responsibilities too. Obviously the therapist has responsibilities, but you got to bring that up. If you don't bring it up, then you're just kind of wasting your money to some extent. If your therapist is saying, a big goal I have for you is I need you to give yourself wholeness. I need you to be able to feel whole. And you're like, what does that mean? So yeah, obviously dig down deep and say, look, I don't care how long it takes. It sounds like it's a very important thing to you as my therapist. I need you to really download what is in your head into my head. And therapists out there, spend some time actually explaining things or put things in words that people understand. Because, Jess, when I hear this phrase, I really have no idea what he's talking about. You said, my therapist brought up practicing giving myself wholeness. Giving myself wholeness, huh? Now, what I suspect, given the context that you gave, is that you feel as though you're not good enough. And what I think he's saying is you need to recognize that you are good enough and not always strive to be something else so that someone else will tell you you're good enough. I think that's what he's talking about, but obviously you would want to talk with him. All right, this next email, anonymous listener from Germany, she writes, is being indecisive a personality disorder? I get very excited about moving to one place and I feel like I made a decision. However, as I talk to other people, they give me different points of view and it is making me confused again. Could these waves of motivation followed by indecisiveness, depression, and sadness be a personality disorder? Or am I just an indecisive person? End of email. Well, indecisiveness can be a component of a few different personality disorders, dependent personality disorder for one, but being indecisive or having a pattern of indecision doesn't necessarily mean that you suffer from personality disorder. But indecision, it can also be a sign of lack of differentiation. It could be a sign of lack of connection with the self, which is often associated with a personality disorder. So, yeah, or it just takes you a while to make a choice. That's okay. Or you change your mind often. It really just depends on if it's causing you problem. But you say that you have waves of motivation followed by indecisiveness, and then you get depressed and sad. So yeah, it sounds like something's going on there that is worth going to therapy for. All right, this next email is from anonymous patron. She asks, how can we help mental health clinicians better accept and understand the existence of dissociative identity disorder? End of question. Yeah, so there's so much to say, and I've talked about this before. I've done whole deep dives on dissociation. I did a whole episode on TikTok and how people seemingly might be faking it and this sort of thing. I was talking with some clinicians recently, and I wasn't a professor. I was just a colleague, and I didn't know these people that well. And long story short, the consensus among these clinicians was that dissociative identity disorder was not a real disorder, and that everyone presenting as it was either faking or it was some other disorder that was being confused with dissociative identity disorder. And I was really shocked by this. These clinicians seemed really sure of themselves, and they seemed to very much feel as though this was the consensus, that the consensus in our field is that dissociative identity disorder doesn't exist. And I find that to just be one of the dumbest things. I've treated people with dissociative identity disorder. There's been tons of research demonstrating that dissociative identity disorder exists. Why is it in the DSM? Now, the DSM is not a flawless document for sure, particularly over the years. But when the authors put things in the DSM, it has to be supported and demonstrated by mounds and mounds of research over the years. And dissociative identity disorder, being in the DSM, of course, has decades and decades and mounds of research demonstrating that it is not only a thing, but it's a distinct thing. Because there are many things that people suffer from, but to get its own label, it has to be a distinct thing. Like there are different types of depression, but they don't get their own label in the DSM. It's all just subsumed underneath major depressive disorder or bipolar or one of the other depressive disorders. But why isn't dissociative identity disorder subsumed under other specified dissociative identity disorders? Because it's its own distinct thing, and enough people suffer from it that it justifies its own place in the DSM. So I do not understand, and as far as I can tell, there are people who, I think there's many roads to clinicians thinking that it doesn't exist. One is that it's a pretty rare disorder, and so as a clinician, you might not either come across it or might not know you come across it. Most people with dissociative identity disorder, which I'll call DID from now on, most people with DID don't know they have DID. They, and listen to all my deep dives on it for more information on that. So there's that. The other thing is people with DID often have other disorders. They have personality disorders or, PTSD or other kinds of things that make it so that any symptom of DID might be thought of as a symptom of some other diagnosis that they have. Because, of course, DID is developed early in life from massive, horrible trauma. So you're likely to have a number of other diagnoses along with it. So that's one reason. Another reason is that there have been some famous cases of people faking it. And so there's that. Another reason is that I think statistically, it has a higher prevalence rate of people faking it. Something like 10% of patients presenting with DID are faking it, which is higher than other disorders. The other thing is that people don't understand that people fake all of the things in the DSM. The fact that
someone heard of a case of someone faking DID and then them saying, therefore, everyone having DID is faking it, is a stupid argument, because people fake major depressive disorder. People fake schizophrenia. There was a famous case of a mob boss, I think in New York City, who successfully for decades faked that he had schizophrenia when he never suffered from that. And it just was a smokescreen so that he could continue to conduct his illegal activities. I don't know if that's apocryphal, but anyway, point is people fake everything in the DSM. That doesn't mean that the things don't exist. It doesn't mean that people don't actually suffer from. Another factor, I think, is that there's a lot of lay people on the internet like saying a lot of things, and I think it's easier just to say, no, it's fake, than to say it's real. Another thing I think is that a lot of people are seemingly increasing the amount of faking that's happening online and on TikTok and stuff to get attention. It seems like that might be happening more. And when people see that, it just kind of makes them cringe, as it does to me too. And if they were sort of on the fence about DID being a real thing, they're like, oh, obviously it's fake. I mean, look at all these people faking it, that kind of thing. I think another factor is that, and I've been a victim of this myself, that when you get burnt a number of times with things and you get tricked by people, then you develop this kind of coat of armor against things that might not be real, and you're like overly skeptical, essentially. And I find that there's a certain group of people that are like overly skeptical of anything that they've been told. And I think that in the colleagues that I heard poo-pooing DID, it seemed like they were coming from that place of like, I know better, you're not going to trick me. You know, this sort of person that's like, that says, well, you know, that's a myth, you know, that kind of person. And I'm kind of that person, by the way, so I'm not degrading that kind of person, but yeah, it's bizarre. You know, it's bizarre that people, because they've never treated someone with DID, they assume it doesn't exist. It's like, if you've never been to Paris and you've never seen the Eiffel Tower in person, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Every expert I know in trauma understands that DID is a real thing. Why? Because they study it and they've treated people with DID. The other thing that people will say is, well, how do you know if they're telling the truth, right? I mean, they could just be lying about, how do you know anyone has DID? Well, by that line of thinking, how do you know anyone has any mental disorder? You could fake everything. You could fake schizophrenia. It could literally be possible that everyone who has ever suffered from major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety or schizophrenia, every one of those people could have been faking it. It would be extremely unlikely. It would be very difficult. It would be strange as to why someone would ruin their lives over something like that. But it's possible that any of the things in the DSM are faking it, including DID. But how do us clinicians and experts believe that these things are involuntary is because when you actually treat these people, you see what happens and you realize that, one, they do not benefit from the diagnosis of DID. One. Two, most people who are diagnosed with DID they don't present as having DID. They present as suicidal and depressed because of all the other problems in their life. And dissociating, and especially DID, is extremely debilitating. Imagine waking up one day and you don't even remember the past 4 days. And everyone's like, do you remember what happened yesterday? You're like, that would be really upsetting, right? Now, some people will say, well, there's strong evidence that DID is a thing because they've hooked people up to biological markers or fMRI scans showing that their different alters have different markers that they're different. And I find this evidence to be interesting, but not super compelling, because you can have different brain scans and different physiological readings when you just change your mood. So we don't have the ability to truly prove that DID exists in the same way that we don't have any way to truly prove that depression exists. But when you're ground level and you work with the people that I've worked with and that other experts of trauma work with,
there's no doubt that DID is a real thing. Now, can some people suffer from something that might be temporarily confused as DID? You know, some people will talk about how their trauma will be triggered, and they'll get real angry and violent, and they'll say, like, it was like I was a different person. And might the therapist go down a road of convincing the client that they have DID when they actually don't? Yeah, that happens sometimes. But that happens again with all the disorders. There are people who are not depressed who get convinced by incompetent therapists that they're depressed, or there are people who have a personality disorder and they get convinced by their clinician that they don't have a personality. You know, there's incompetence that happens, but that doesn't mean that DID doesn't exist. And it's frustrating because, one, I find that when people talk about DID not existing, they either have an agenda of some political agenda or something, you know, the way that Tom Cruise talks about how psychiatry doesn't exist, or you know, or it's harmful, or it's a conspiracy. It has that kind of, it's not that bad, but it has that kind of ignorance to me. The other thing is that it denies people, you know, people who have DID are some of the most suffering individuals on the planet. They have suffered so much difficulty and trauma, and their dissociative identity disorder is a coping mechanism for that difficulty. And for clinicians to come along and mansplain that they don't actually have a thing and that they're just making it up, I find to be extremely distasteful. And I find that it's like, hey, pal, how about you spend some time with actual people with DID and get back to me? How about that? All right, next email is from anonymous patron. She writes, I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to go about getting premarital counseling. I think many people out there still think premarital counseling is a last resort before divorce. Even though I have a loving relationship and we currently communicate very well, I think everyone, including myself, in a committed relationship could benefit from premarital counseling. When should one seek premarital counseling? How should one broach the subject with your partner? How does one pair this with their own individual therapy? What kinds of questions should we be asking a therapist prior to choosing one? End of email. Yeah, absolutely. In a perfect world, I would imagine that a lot of couples would go to therapy, couples therapy, not only premarital, but throughout their relationship, even when things aren't going horribly wrong. Because every couple I know could use a session once a month at least, if not more often. There's always something that someone did that kind of hurt your feelings. There's always something that you're worried about bringing up. There's always something that could be tweaked, especially when you have kids. There's always a conversation to be had about parenting. So in a perfect world, everyone would go to couples therapy throughout their relationship periodically, whether that's once a month, once a week, maybe they take a break for 6 months and they start back up. The couples that I've worked with over the years, that's what it's like. Even when we get things going pretty well for them, they still come in because there's always something to talk about. So there's that. Then you say, when should one seek premarital counseling? Well, I answer that question. How should one broach the subject with your partner? Well, I've talked about this before, that you can't get someone to go to therapy if they don't want to. So don't get your hopes up. It's a question you're asking. You're like, hey, I want to go to couples counseling with my partner, even though things aren't going horribly wrong. But the attitude you should have is, my partner might not want to go, and I'm just going to have to live with that. And that sucks, but that's my experience. Now, doesn't mean you give up if they say no, but it does mean that you shouldn't get your hopes up. So, but you go to your partner and say, hey, I love our relationship. I think we're doing really well. And I just feel like if we went to premarital counseling, that it might help us to make it even better, or might help us to identify what we're doing well. Maybe that would help. Then you say, how does one pair it with your own individual therapy? Couples therapy pairs extremely well with individual therapy. Sometimes your therapists have to coordinate. Your last question, what types of questions would you ask the therapist prior to choosing one? Well, I would just ask the therapist
I would tell the therapist what you're looking for. Say like, well, I'd like to work on this. Our relationship is going pretty well. I give, provide your situation in 30 seconds, and then ask a therapist what they would do with you. And if they can answer that in a way that makes sense to you, then, give them a shot. All right, this next email is from anonymous patron. They say, I had a recent attempt to seek a corrective experience, but it resulted in a very hurtful experience instead. Is the only path forward to just try again? End of question. Yeah, and they give a longer email, but essentially that's the question. And the answer is yes. The answer is yes, try again, of course. I don't know your situation. I don't know the precise nature of what you should try again. I don't know if you should give it some time. But I find this question is based on the idea, or I find this question to be teetering on the idea of, do we really have to interact with others in order to have a corrective experience? And the answer is no. I mean, you can have corrective experiences with yourself or even with an idea. Like, say your mom dies and you go to her grave and you have a conversation with her and you imagine that she is looking down on you and is saying certain things to you. You don't know precisely what she's saying. It's not like you're talking to a ghost, but you just get this vibe like she wants you to feel okay about yourself, or that your mom's proud of you or something. That could be a corrective experience. It could be argued that you're literally talking to nothing and you're just making stuff up in your head. And that is, or you're literally talking to the spirit of your mom. Either way, you're not involving another human on this planet, and you could absolutely have a corrective experience. You can also have a corrective experience on your own, where you take care of yourself, where you have self-compassion and you do positive self-talk, that kind of stuff. Those are always corrective experiences that we do all the time. But to heal quickly and to some extent heal our working model of others, we have to interface with others. And I know that sucks, and I've talked about this before, that for some people, they'll email me and they'll just be like, but I don't want to interact with, I don't trust other people. Things don't go well with other people. I don't, you're telling me that the only way for me to heal is to have corrective experiences with other human beings, but I don't want to. That's never gone well for me. And I don't know anyone's particular situation, but generally speaking, the answer is, yeah, I hear you, but that's the way it's got to be. It's like saying, I want to get over my fear of heights without actually facing my fear of heights. In order to overcome one's fear of heights, in order to cure yourself of the fear of heights, you have to do an exposure regimen that slowly exposes you to heights, and eventually you habituate to heights. It's similar to other human beings. If other human beings really stress you out in general because of the traumas you've gone through, the way that you can habituate to other humans and feel safe with other humans is to have experienced safety with other humans. And I know that's rough. And, it sounds like you tried to engineer a corrective experience. You're like, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. My therapist or Kirk or someone was telling me to do this. So, okay, fine. I'll try to have a corrective experience with someone. And then it didn't go well. And then you're like, well, wait. So the thing I'll say to that is, if it were easy, then no one would have any relational traumas, like, yeah, it's rough. And I don't have any, delusion that somehow this isn't hard. It's very hard. And the more relationally traumatized you are, the more in need of relational corrective experiences you need, and the more fear you're going to have about exposing yourself to that. So, it's rough. But yeah, the short answer to your question is, even though I try to, have a corrective experience and it didn't go well, do I really have to try again? And the short answer is yes, but, do it with therapeutic supervision. And that's where therapy comes in, because when people come to me, I engineer a corrective experience with them as my clients, and I know how to make sure that it doesn't go poorly for them. And so when you're trying to engineer a corrective, particularly if you were particularly relationally traumatized, if you're trying to engineer corrective experiences in the wild, that has a lot of danger. I won't go into the details on it, why, but I've talked about before that you could inadvertently create a situation that was doomed from the start because of your working models and because of your repetition compulsion. So that's where a therapist comes in, because a therapist who understands corrective experiences can really resist the urges of falling back into old patterns that you're trying to recreate. All right, this very last patron email, annual patron Kim from Arizona says, will you ever do a deep dive on schizotypal personality disorder? After having a psychotic break 4 years ago and being bounced around from doctor to doctor and being diagnosed as bipolar, schizoaffective, OSDD, and all this wild stuff, I asked my therapist what he thought my diagnosis was. He told me schizotypal personality disorder, and it seems to fit like a glove. I was wondering if you would ever do a deep dive on this one. End of email. Yeah, absolutely. All the personality disorders left on, that I haven't talked about are definitely on my short list of future deep dives. Schizotypal, schizoid, paranoid, I don't think I've done. And I don't think I've done obsessive compulsive personality disorder either, deep dive. But yeah, definitely schizotypal is on the list. And, I'm glad that you found a therapist that seems to understand you. And schizotypal, in a nutshell, is very easy, particularly if you had a psychotic break, is easily misdiagnosed as other things. So, I'm glad that you're getting the help you need. If you want to, Kim, you could email me kind of a full write-up at some point. I don't know when I'll get around to it, but I could put it in a doc, because often it's helpful to have, case studies and people's experience with these disorders to help the listeners understand. So you might be able to help me out with that. And along those lines, I have been really wanting to do a lot more deep dives. I feel like 2022 will be a year where I'll have the luxury to be able to do that. I hope. Pretty much every day of my life, I think about, okay, how can I get my life in order so I can start doing the deep dives that I want to get to? Like it's my mission in life, for my own perfectionism, my own desire to please the patrons, my own desire to learn, my own just personal goals in life, to do a lot more deep dives. So hopefully we'll get to that. So that is the end of my Google Doc that has everyone's email in it. If I didn't get to your email and you're a patron, it's possible that your email is in a doc for Rebecca episodes or Bob episodes or Berto episodes. Or I didn't understand your question, so I just didn't include it. or you literally didn't ask a question. Some people will email in like a long description and there's no question in there. And so sometimes I can infer the question, but other times I'm like, I don't really know what to say about this. The other thing is that, remember that you got to keep these emails short because I do not have time to read long emails. I will ask you for more information if I need it. So if it's a super, super long email, sometimes it just gets deleted because I don't have the time to sift through everything. And it says clearly on the form, like, brief description, 1 to 3 sentences or something like that. And people will, now many of you will say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I droned on and you only wrote like 5 sentences. It's not a big deal. I'm talking about people that literally give me just pages and pages, and I understand it. It's like people want to give me information, but it says on the form, don't do that, please. Because it stresses us out. It'd be one thing if we just got me and Podwife. So the way this whole thing works is Stacy she gets the emails, and then she puts all the emails in these various different Google Docs that we share and stuff. And so it stresses her out too, because she has to read the emails to figure out which doc to put it in. The other thing is she's not a therapist. So some of y'all are, putting some intense stuff in there that I can handle, but my wife sometimes, she'll come around the corner crying, just be like, because she's a non-clinician, she's a regular human, and so when she reads and she's an empathetic person, so when she reads these emails, like, it can really be rough for her. She recovers. She doesn't destroy her life, but just some background on that. The other thing is that I was telling my wife, we were walking the dogs a couple hours ago, and I was like, I'm almost done with all the Patron emails. And she's like, no, you're not. I have hundreds of emails in the inbox that I've yet to put in the Google Doc. So if you sent an email recently, they haven't been processed yet. I hope to actually do another episode in which I try to get to many of the non-Patron emails. So maybe I'll do that next time. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.